Right, everyone, good afternoon. We're just about to start. It's just coming up to 1 o'clock now. I'd like to welcome you to the second of our Education, Humanities and Social Sciences webinar series. Last week, we were privileged to have Vince Cable and Trevor Williams talking about the economy after coronavirus. Now, this week, we have two of our postgraduate students. First of all, we have Paul Bryant, who's in the Department of Education, or the School of Institute of Education, and he's going to be talking about a cloister in the world, exploring emerging visions of leadership in contemporary Benedictine school chaplaincy. So Paul's going to speak first, and then we're going to move on to Louisa, who will be talking about the emotional impacts of mixed proficiency levels in the corporate language in multinational teams. I hope that you'll join us for more of these webinars. We're running a series of them every Thursday at 1 p.m. And next week, we'll be having Dr. Chris Wild and a colleague of his from Richmond University, who will be talking about South American politics. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over now to Paul Bryant, who will be delivering his paper. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'll just get my PowerPoint organized. There we go. And slideshow. Okay, good afternoon. I'll begin this talk about Benedictine leadership with a brief introduction to the life of Saint Benedict and the emergence of the Benedictine monastic tradition within Western civilization. Because without that context, it is not possible to understand the true nature of Benedictine leadership and what it can offer us today in the 21st century. So here we have an overview of the presentation. The life of Saint Benedict, the ecclesiastical context, 1 in several billion, understanding the character of Benedictine leadership, leadership as Abba, Father, fieldwork, and questions, followed by bibliography and references. The Benedictine vision of leadership emerges out of a 1500-year-old monastic tradition, started by one man, Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was a Roman citizen who lived from 480 to 557 AD, a time when the Roman Empire, which under the protection of its just law and order, had united so many peoples, nations and tribes, was collapsing. Tainter explains that the causes of the collapse were numerous, including Roman decadence, bureaucratic growth, excessive taxation, the decline of martial spirit, the landed gentry's lack of vision and ignorance, the betrayal of the peasantry, the demoralization of the exploited classes, bad leadership, and increasing state authoritarianism. As Tainter explains, to the people of Rome, the empire was a symbol of strength, stability, and eternity. Its collapse shook the foundations of people's beliefs. If the impregnable fortress of Roman rule was vulnerable, then nothing was safe. During this heady mix of fear and panic, Benedict was a student in Rome, but he was so disgusted by the degeneracy he found there that he decided to set out on his own path to find God in the peace and solitude of the surrounding countryside. Before long, his love of wisdom, peacefulness, and joy attracted followers and continues to do so 1500 years later. According to Pope Pius XII, Benedict was a star in the darkness of night, shining brilliantly during gloomy and stormy times. His love of wisdom, peacefulness, and joy, offering a promise of protection, guidance, and leadership during a dark century when the position and fate of civilization, as well as of the church and of civil society, was in danger of collapse. Nevertheless, as Pius XII clarifies, Benedict emerged out of the divine foundations of the church to give hope to all people during this mighty storm and universal upheaval. Benedict enabled the church to vanquish the trials and tribulations of the age. Out of the doctrine and teaching of Christ, mold a bright future for people, societies, and Western civilization. It is from these historic roots in the life of Saint Benedict that the loving, courageous, wise, peaceful, and joyful character of Benedictine leadership emerges. Benedict did not follow the crowd. When he saw something was wrong in Roman society, he had the courage and wisdom to follow his own path. As Bill George, Professor of Management Practice at the Harvard Business School, would say, Benedict found and followed his true north because he had the humility to be honest with himself. The unintentional outcome of this was that Benedict became an authentic leader, someone people would follow. 1 in several billion. Saint Benedict's life has had an impact far beyond anything he would ever have imagined. When he went into the Italian countryside to seek God, his role models were the desert fathers of ancient Egypt, who had left behind family and friends, career and comforts, to seek God in a life of prayerful solitude. The monks who Benedict emulated did not live together in communities, and Benedict did not intend to, until followers began to gather around him, insisting he become their leader. In the beginning, Benedict was a reluctant and naive community leader. He was so strict that his brothers tried to kill him. He was so holy that some jealous local priests tried to ruin him. He ran away from it all. Still, people sought him out, and thus he had little choice but to learn how to lead community life. By the end of his life, he had established 12 monastic communities, all living together according to his rule, through which he delegated responsibility to a local community leader. Monastic communities live their shared life together according to a rule, which is normally interpreted and applied by the abbot, the community leader. Borrowing liberally from ancient monastic rules, Benedict crafted his own rule as a foundation for his communities. Of all the monastic rules, Benedict's was notably gentle, moderate, and flexible. Benedict recognized the need to look after both the weak and the strong, and those of every sort of temperament. He also recognized the need for the abbot to adapt the rule to local circumstances and customs. Benedict knew that the only communities which flourish are those which recognize that all people are unique individuals, and thus give them space to be themselves, whilst also being part of the community. Benedict was correct. His monasteries flourished. During the reign of Pope Saint Gregory the Great, the Benedictine rule became the standard within the whole Roman Catholic Church. During the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne made Benedict's rule the standard within the entire Frankish Empire, and his personal guide to leadership. Thus, Benedict's leadership influenced the whole character of Europe and Western civilization as we know it. And it all happened because Benedict understood human nature, community life, and the importance of fair, humble, servant leadership, which integrated individual needs with the community to achieve the best for both. Understanding the character of Benedictine leadership. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, in a Benedictine monastery, the abbot holds ultimate responsibility for leadership. Benedict uses 4 images to explore the leadership and authority of the abbot: Abba, shepherd, doctor, and steward. According to Dollard, Marrett, Crosby, and Wright, each of the images that Benedict uses come from the understanding of authority as a way of following Christ, first of all, and then of being like Christ to others. Given the time available today, in the next section, I will explain the leadership role of Abba. Abba means father. Christ was called Abba. Benedict teaches that to be worthy of the task of governing a monastery, the abbot must always remember what his title signifies and act as he should. He is believed to hold the place of Christ in the monastery, since he is addressed by a title of Christ. Dollard, Marrett, Crosby, and Wright explain that the name abbot describes a vision of leadership and authority that points to God himself. The abbot is to imitate Christ's authority in being of service to others. He is the sign of Christ, the sign of hope for his monks. Remembering what he is and what he is called, Benedict insists that the abbot must know what a difficult and demanding burden he has undertaken. Directing souls and serving a variety of temperaments, coaxing, reproving, and encouraging them as appropriate. Nevertheless, regardless of how difficult the task is, the abbot is to show equal love to everyone and apply the same discipline to all according to their merits. Benedict explains that anyone who receives the name of abbot is to lead his disciples more by example than by words. teaching receptive disciples with words, but demonstrating to the stubborn and the dull by a living example. For the monastic community to flourish, the abbot must listen and learn by consulting the whole community before making important decisions. And after hearing the advice of the brothers, he must ponder it and follow what he judges to be the wiser course. The abbot and the community are united in their search for God. Nevertheless, the decision is the abbot's to make, so that when he has determined what is more prudent, all may obey. Just as it is proper for disciples to obey their master, so it is becoming for the master on his part to settle everything with foresight and fairness. Benedict knew that for the preservation of peace and love, it is best for the abbot to make all decisions in the conduct of his monastery. As Cardon explains, to bear this responsibility, the abbot requires the gift of discernment. Discernment is one of the rarest gifts. Explaining how to be discerning, Benedict teaches his abbot to always observe the apostle's recommendation, in which he says, use argument, appeal, reproof. This means that he must vary with circumstances, threatening and coaxing by turns. Stern as a taskmaster, devoted and tender as only a father can be. With the undisciplined and restless, he will use firm argument. With the obedient and docile and patient, he will appeal for greater virtue. But as for the negligent and disdainful, we charge him to use reproof and rebuke. He should not gloss over the sins of those who err, but cut them out while he can, as soon as they begin to sprout. The vital skill for the abbot is knowing when to be gentle and when to be firm. For Williams, without discernment, the abbot will cause more harm than good. The abbot does not give orders, but patiently discovers how each monk will flourish in the stability of the community, not encouraging selfish individualism, but nurturing an active peacefulness that allows each monk to be unique. As Pius XII explains, the abbot's discernment seeks to nurture the gifts of the Spirit even-handedly within the community. And like a loving father, he governs and leads each soul in his care to evangelical perfection. To achieve evangelical perfection, Benedictine monks make 3 vows, one of which is obedience, understood as the narrow road that leads to life. It is the first step of humility. As Valente explains, in a Benedictine monastery, obedience is the foundation of community life and of wholesome relationships with other people and with God. The Latin roots of the word obedience mean listen. A monk who listens to his superiors listens to God, and his salvation is assured. Benedict taught his monks to listen to one another, judge what is best for the other, and then lay aside their desires. Wise choices and trusting obedience of this kind lead to freedom and lead to God. However, as Stuart and Benedict XVI explain, only when a monk obeys an abbot faithfully and lovingly does he learn humility and become ever more Christ-like. Lived this way, obedience is holy and sacramental. In contemporary culture, obedience is not a popular word, and when reading Benedict's rule, his description of obedience is intimidating. Benedict teaches his monks to carry out the superior's orders as promptly as if the command came from God himself. They are to immediately put aside their own concerns, abandon their own will, and lay down whatever they have in hand, leaving it unfinished. With the ready step of obedience, they follow the voice of authority in their actions. The monk is not to ask questions, but simply to do as he is told, when he is told. Cardon and Longenecker agree that this vision of obedience could easily be mistaken for a prompt, military-like obedience. For Cardon, Benedict's demand for absolute obedience could be worrying because it is not entirely clear whether such obedience leads to God rather than just the automatic reflex of compliance. However, as Cardon and Longenecker clarify, Benedict's obedience differs from military obedience because Benedict wants his monks to obey cheerfully and without grumbling. So the responsibility rests with the abbot to nurture glad and willing obedience. As Hisker and Ulrich clarify, Benedictine leaders earned their right to command glad and willing obedience from their followers in direct proportion to their ability to sincerely listen to their followers, concerns and needs. The leader's ability to listen and serve their followers with integrity is the foundation of their right to ask for obedience within the community. To help the abbots bear the responsibility for the obedience they are given, Wright offers 4 pieces of leadership advice which are developed with reference to other scholars in the field. 1. Do not become too absorbed in the busyness of everyday life. Keep life in perspective. Prioritize the human dimension. 2. Learn to trust the brethren, and they will learn to trust their abbot. The brothers need to know that their abbot thinks carefully before asking them to do something. The abbot must maintain a true sense of balance between prayer, community, hospitality, and work. The abbot must always listen to the brothers. Beyond their initial ardour of the monastic vocation and the vows made upon entry to a community, the obedience owed by a monk to his abbot depends just as much upon the trust that the monk has in the abbot's ability and willingness to care for his soul. Number 3, be patient and do not despair. People change slowly. They make mistakes. They need forgiveness and reconciliation. An abbot must lead his community through good times and bad with faith and courage. 4, an abbot must lead with personal integrity. To lead as Christ, they must follow Christ. To form the brothers in Christ, they must be formed in Christ. For Benedict, life in the monastery starts and ends with obedience. Nevertheless, it is important to understand that Benedict protects his monks from the dangers of a harsh and authoritarian abbot. Benedict XVI and Barrett, Berry, Bevan, Foster and Johns clarify that the monk owes obedience to the abbot only insofar as the abbot leads his flock to God. And to help keep the abbot's feet on the ground, Benedict reminds him that his teaching and his obedience will come under God's scrutiny. Cardon clarifies that because the rule invests such massive authority in the abbot, it counterbalances it with grave responsibility and the threat of severe judgment. Benedict's abbot is not to be an unaccountable despot, but rather a responsible, loving father who trusts his brothers and enables them to learn to trust him. Wright and Merton explain how important it is for an abbot and his brothers to learn to trust one another. It is the foundation of obedience. Developing this theme, Merton explains that upon entering the community, the brothers agree to trust that God commands them through a fallible man. However, as Zand clarifies, unless the conditions are right, trust is elusive, particularly in the fast-changing dynamics of the 21st century, which drive a swift interplay between change and stability. Zand identifies 2 essential leadership skills for building trust. 1, managing stability by minimizing internal uncertainty caused by poor decisions, unnecessary delays, and misallocation of resources, poor use of manpower, misuse of equipment, and failure to solve recurring problems. 2, managing change by developing strategies to cope with external uncertainty, economic, political, and social, arising from forces beyond an organization's control or influence. In 21st century organizations, these leadership skills are necessary for building stable communities in which trust can flourish. Research. The specific focus of my research is emerging visions of leadership in contemporary Benedictine school chaplaincy. It is taking place within 3 English Benedictine schools. The major challenge and opportunity facing these schools is the present decline in the number of monastic vocations, and thus of a monastic leadership force. 30 years ago, many of the leadership roles, especially the head teacher, were held by Benedictine monks. Thus, the Benedictine culture and ethos of the school were easily maintained by their presence as living witnesses to the Benedictine monastic tradition. If these schools are continued to have a Benedictine culture and ethos, they now need to be maintained and transmitted by men and women who are not monks. And my question is that possible? And if so, how? So, in 21 interviews conducted during the last 18 months, I have sought to ascertain exactly what is understood to be the Benedictine culture and ethos, the extent to which they are reliant upon monastic leadership, and the possibilities of maintaining and transmitting the Benedictine culture and ethos through lay leadership. Unsurprisingly, I have encountered a wide variety of understanding about the possibilities for the future of Benedictine school chaplaincy leadership. However, there has been extraordinary consistency in the participants' understanding of what the major Benedictine concepts mean. The divergences concern the possibilities and opportunities for the future of lay leadership. I finished my 21st interview yesterday. The challenge now is to present and analyse the data. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really interesting. I hope everyone else found that inspiring and something that I don't know about at all. So really good to be introduced to a whole new subject. There is a little Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and if you have questions that you want to ask, then please feel free to use the Q&A function. We'll have time for questions at the end, so if there's anything that you want to ask Paul, or if there's anything that you want to ask Louisa in the next paper, then please feel free to add your comments to that. So now I'm going to pass you over to Louisa Weindel, and over to you, Louisa. We can't hear you, Louisa.
I'm just going to share my screen now with PowerPoint. So it should start in the beginning. Yes. Can you hear me now?
All good, Louisa. Okay,
all right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending these talks. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about my thesis, my research, which is the emotional impact of mixed proficiency levels in the corporate language in multinational teams. Some years ago, I was in corporate life as an HR director, and it was so common at senior leadership meetings to discuss what the overriding attribute that we would be looking for in the people that we were hiring. And as a multinational with the corporate language of English, the overriding attribute was that they should be articulate and have a good command of the English language, basically to ensure that everyone could communicate across regions, across cultures, to ensure that we could keep misunderstandings to a minimum. But of course, this got me thinking, because I knew that in the other regions of the world, in the Far East and all over the world, in Europe, most people on a day-to-day basis would interact in their local language and only really use the corporate language for email, video conferences, and so on. So when it came to selecting what I would read, what I would study and research for my doctorate, it was really quite a natural choice for me. I really wanted to look more into how this worked in other regions across the world who have to interact on a daily basis in a language which is not their native one, and how this affects their interaction. Because I remember seeing very much some of the difficulties, some of the anxieties felt amongst our international teams. And so, but interestingly enough, English has been the corporate language of so many multinationals over the last 30 years. This has actually been very under-researched up until recently. Recently, I have to say that it actually is attracting a lot of interest from academics. And, but we keep thinking, why was this neglected for so long? And I can only think that the reason was that because multinationals had adopted a corporate language of English, that they felt that they had actually removed the problem and that everybody was quite happy speaking English and that there were no language barriers anymore. But as you can see from these quotes here, a number of academics now are actually focusing on this particular area, and it is increasing the attention for research. My particular area is, because I saw the anxiety that language barriers caused, I'm looking particularly at the emotions that are elicited from speaking a foreign language. And that to date, there has only been one single article that has focused particularly on the areas of communication across language barriers in multinational teams. And this paper was by Helena Tensa and Marcus Podalko of the University of Tübingen. The interesting, their paper focuses on the automotive sector, two large automotive multinationals in Germany. But what they are doing, which is different to me, they actually uncoupled language and culture. In my book, actually, I feel that language and culture are very closely linked, and in my research, they are actually they are coupled together. One other article which came to light was the article by Neely, Hines and Crampton, which actually also highlighted some of the anxiety and frustration that was felt between non-native speakers and native speakers. And this is a diagram from their paper called The Unhidden Turmoil of Language in Global Collaboration. And as you can see, the writers describe how non-native speakers of a corporate language are apprehensive to speak up for fear of not being understood, for fear of misunderstandings, or also fear for loss of face. And losing face when speaking a foreign language is really quite a hurdle. And I think it's a hurdle for all of us in some ways. I know I speak other languages too, but also I notice so much that people do, it is actually quite, you need to be quite, it's quite a leap of courage that you need in order to actually be confident in speaking another language and not feeling, particularly against other people with different proficiency levels and particularly native speakers, that it actually does cause some anxiety. So as you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the non-native speakers feeling communication and anxiety. And then on the other side, the native speakers sometimes losing patience. And in this particular study by Neely, Hines and Crampton, their respondents also found that they got so frustrated that they would even leave meetings, delete correspondence, even actually also just actually ignore and discount the non-native speaker's contribution, which really kind of frustrates any kind of collaboration. Actually, at the bottom, of course, you can see they recommend empathetic responses, which obviously does work very well. But again, it is something that needs to be kept up and really emphasized by leadership. So in my two main research questions are actually examining the emotional impact of mixed proficiency levels in the corporate language and multinational teams, but also to try and identify effective strategies to mitigate some of these problems and also to optimize collaboration. So really looking to try and find some positive solutions to some of these problems that do occur. And in the research, I'm going to highlight to you today the data and the analysis of my first study, because I conducted 12 semi-structured interviews, adopted a qualitative approach in order to gather information. This is really at the moment a very under-researched area, and the aim was, of course, to gather as much in terms of experiences and also to try and identify some suggestions, some ideas from some of the respondents in terms of how we can actually create better coping mechanisms, to create a better approach towards communicating in a foreign language, and particularly when there is pressure there, to make sure that this is all successful and to maintain good collaboration. And my study, this study, I interviewed 12 members of 2 multinational teams from different corporations. There were 8 women, 4 men. They were all mid-senior to senior career level. 8 fluent speakers. They were all pretty fluent. Some were more fluent than others, I have to say, and 4 native speakers of the corporate language, and 2 of those were team leaders. And these individuals were situated in teams. They were working in virtual teams across the world. They were based in Asia, South America, Europe, and also the States. And for the analysis, I used, as I said, I used a qualitative approach, and this was thematic analysis. Thematic analysis, of course, is an umbrella term for several different approaches of analyzing qualitative data, and there are many different versions of thematic analysis. I have to say, when we were looking at the approach, I came across varying different guises of thematic analysis. Of course, they all share some degree of theoretical flexibility, and they can differ enormously in terms of how they, of the underlying philosophy and procedures for producing themes. I used the Brown and Clark approach, which characterizes a more critical, reflective approach to research, both as a process and as a practice. This comes down to reflexivity, acknowledging one's own role as a researcher in the production and analysis of the data that we are looking at. I was fortunate to have my supervisor, Lubna Ahmed. She also analysed the data together with me, so we could achieve better inter-rater reliability, and we achieved a very high level of consistency. So here we come to the thematic map 1, and as you can see here, the main theme, the key theme here was accommodation. And accommodation also breaks down into sub-themes. And when I say accommodation, I mean accommodation in the face of events which occurred as a result of communicating with mixed proficiency level speakers in English, which was the corporate language. And we had here emotional, some of those events, some of the accommodation was of an emotional nature. I'm going to try and give some examples, but I don't think we're going to have time for examples for every single one of the themes today, but I will give some as I go along. But when we talk about emotional accommodation, we are looking at people who felt emotions but had to accommodate them. They either accommodated them because they were present, or they felt them very much within themselves as they experienced a particular event, or they changed their behavior because of the change in behavior, that emotion was actually absent. So you see emotional here, present, meaning that the individual felt it themselves and they felt some pain, confusion and stress as a result of it. And then it was absent because they changed their behavior in order to remove that emotion. There was also cognitive accommodation. Cognitive people were changing the way they think in order to change their feelings. So we had here concentration and focus, people actually concentrating so much in order to ensure that they were could understand, or basically that they could manage their emotion in that particular instance. And then mental agility. On the right hand side you can see practical and preparatory accommodation, and here individuals were actually taking particular preparatory measures or practical measures to accommodate particular issues that were occurring as a result of communication across language barriers. You can see here time delay. Sometimes that was in relation to perhaps needing more time to understand individuals. There were also frustrations and stress felt because of translation software not delivering what was hoped for. There was also concentration while listening, and that required some struggling there. I mean, one particular instance that I can cite in terms of that particular concentration was someone really needing to take a lot of time to understand someone, particularly if they had an accent, a strong accent. They needed more time and to make sure that they were in a quiet room to listen to that particular person. Lack of foresight, that was also an interesting instance. A team leader had one member of his team in China who was delivering a particular presentation. I think it was after work one evening, and he was driving home, and he actually felt very embarrassed and annoyed at himself that he couldn't hear this particular team member's talk very well because he was driving. And it was because the team member's English was perhaps not so clear, and he had an accent, that he felt cross with himself that because he couldn't hear the talk, he couldn't ask questions. And so therefore the emotions that he felt were embarrassment and annoyance at himself. Again, harnessing communications with virtual teams. Again, another instance there was where a team leader felt she struggled very much to keep her team together because of the different levels of communication, and was worried a lot of the time that they didn't understand each other because they were all communicating in English, and she wasn't always able to kind of keep up to speed with how well people were actually understanding everything together. And as a result, she had to often go back and double check understanding. The second main theme we have here is muted expression and constraint. And this was really about some non-native speakers feeling the pressure to speak, but often being held back because they felt frustrated that they couldn't speak up as well as native speakers. They felt challenged and nervous, and sometimes very just worried that they couldn't keep up. And again, the top box here, the pressure to succeed. Again, there was a sales engineer who was feeling very much that he was at a loss, that his career was being held back because of his proficiency in the corporate language. Then on the right-hand side, of course, we have the native English speakers who were also observing some of these emotions felt by other team members. And also their feelings of, very often they were feelings of empathy and feelings of concern, and trying to alter again some of their kind of to try and help as much as possible to support their non-native speakers' difficulties. And then I'll move to the final thematic map here we have, which is opacity, ambiguity, and misunderstandings. And of course, this was really very much down to, it comes down to, I think I have to say my studies are very much interdisciplinary. And I think here we have to bring in cross-cultural pragmatics, which is all about how language acquires meaning in different contexts, and that speakers' intention is not always translating so easily into other people's contexts and different cultures. In the top box, you have cultural and linguistic clumsiness. There were a couple of interesting examples here. One particularly, which I would love to share with you, is about a Japanese lady who undertook a course at a German university, and the lecturer was to deliver the course in English. There were a number of non-German speaking participants in the course, But every now and then the German lecturer would revert into German. And because there were, of course, it was in Germany, and of course there were a lot of people in the audience who were Germans, and he would forget that about the non-German speaking attendees. And she felt very much she couldn't put her hand up and say that she didn't understand. And for quite a while, this continued in this way, until one day when her Swedish colleague actually put up her hand and said, "Hey, what's that?" And finally, actually, the lecturer did actually go back into English. But this actually is what we call, actually in linguistics, is called negotiation of meaning. It's actually having that to stop the actual interaction and say, "Please explain to me." So, and of course, this is very, very common, particularly when you have interaction between native speakers and non-native speakers. And again, it does elicit emotions. There is fear, frustration, loss of face. And there are a number of different aspects here too. We have adopting a cultural mindset adjustment, communication breakdown, where perhaps, that one particular example for communication breakdown might be an email trail, where email is starting off in English, but then it might go into another language. This was about another team member told me about this, until the whole email trail had lost its meaning because it had gone into different languages, particularly into Danish in this instance, and not everybody understood it. So people were just understanding tidbits. So unfortunately, this, in the end, it got to a very painful end, she was describing to me. And again, it is communication breakdown. Detachment from the rest of the team. This is another instance where perhaps people don't always understand everything. And again, the negotiation of meaning, do they put their hands up to say, "I don't understand"? Probably not, because it does require courage. It actually requires to stop the whole interaction and for someone to actually jump in and say, "Yes, this is what we mean." It is, again, another challenge, and requires a little bit of intuition from the team leader to actually sort that out. So anyway, here we have the third main aspect. This is actually a thematic map which brings them all together. So in thematic analysis, that was the first stage. This is the final stage, where you can actually see all of the main themes and the sub-themes all together. Now, I've just got some slides here that I'm just adding on quickly, just to highlight, and if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send these to you, highlighting the different emotions that came from those different themes, because perhaps I've sort of gone through it quite quickly for everyone, but if you are interested to know more, do please let me know. So this is the collapsed detail. The next steps in my research will be to move forward a little. I've got more work to do on this study one, particularly in relation to finding solutions, and perhaps looking at the second research question I talked about. Also looking to publish a paper, and then the second stage will be to use the results and also to perhaps use them in exploring focus groups in various locations to see the degree of overlap in those results, and also to look further at identifying solutions. My expected contribution will be looking to look at context very much for multinational teams. I'd like to also look at expanding diversity training, because diversity so far tends to focus very much on cultural, racial and gender and generational differences. And now I believe that we could actually look at cross-lingual sensitivity as an additional dimension in diversity. And then, as I said already, to identify strategies to mitigate problematic issues in communicating across different language proficiency levels and the emotions induced by them. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, and there's my references. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I'm going to open up the questions. There is a little questions tab at the bottom. We've got a bit of time. If anyone would like to ask any questions of Louisa or Paul, there's none up there just at the moment, but feel free. I've got a couple of questions actually. I think it's always really interesting how when we put two papers together that might be looking at slightly different disciplines, there's always an overlap there. And Paul, I didn't know whether you had picked up on anything that Louisa was talking about in terms of that negotiation of meaning, and also in the kind of leadership strategies that Louisa was talking about. Although it's in business, how does it apply to kind of leadership in schools?
One of the reasons I was initially very interested in the Benedictine monastic tradition from an educational perspective was upon visiting a monastery, the great welcome that you get in a monastery. And one of the foundations of the Benedictine monastic tradition is hospitality. And these two things go together, because hospitality is not just about greeting someone at the guest house and offering them a cup of tea. It's actually about welcoming them as who they are, where they are on their journey in life, whatever that might be, whether they're Christian, whether they're LGBT, whatever it might be. The Benedictines are non-judgmental and they welcome people. And obviously in a educational context, that's fantastic, because children need a secure base from which to grow. And hospitality is also about linguistic hospitality as well, which links really well with what Louisa's talking about. So, you know, I teach theology, philosophy and religion, and it's a subject which it's very easy to say, when someone gives you an answer, it's very easy to say, oh, that's not quite right, and to explain a doctrinal point of view. And it's definitional. And actually, an important part of linguistic hospitality is recognizing that the words that people use are just simply words, and there is often a great, much deeper meaning and understanding behind those words. And so actually there's a lot simply to be said just for praising people for making an effort to get involved, to understanding that the metaphors they use are simply, they understand them very differently to the way that you might understand them as well.
Louisa, do you want to come back on that? Absolutely. I think that's a very fair point, because it's actually, the words that we say, they do always arrive in a different world, but it's actually understanding that meaning and getting that meaning across and ensuring that it's actually understood in the way it's intended.
Michelle, Paul's put a question up, which is, Paul, thank you. Do you think from your early findings from the interviews that head teachers are very conscious of the heritage of the Benedictine abbot tradition in the way they see their identity as a head teacher in the school?
Yes, definitely. Although I think it has to be said now that they don't see themselves as in place of the abbot. So in recent years in the Benedictine schools, there has been something of a separation between the monastic house and the school. So they are still Benedictine foundations, but the headmasters or the head teachers, I've spoken to one headmistress and two headmasters, and they very much see themselves as Catholics first and foremost, working within a Benedictine school and supporting the Benedictine tradition. And that is very important to them, you know, maintaining that tradition, that charism, that ethos. But they're all very clear that they are not abbots.
Okay.
Yes.
Michelle, thank you very much for your question.
You're welcome.
Louisa, did you have anything to add to that? I mean, I guess in terms of leadership comes the background or perhaps the sort of the faith identity of leaders in business. I don't know whether you've looked any further into that.
One thing yes, I mean, I'm thinking particularly in what Paul was talking about. I liked very much his thinking about integrating the individual needs with the team, which was what St. Benedict advocated. And of course, that is very much what the leadership I experienced by both of those team leaders was reflecting. They were very much looking to integrate the needs of their team. And in order to be successful, one has to remember that leadership in business is very much focused on the bottom line. And that's part of the struggle that was actually, because of obviously the language barriers, it was the struggle that is what people were encountering in business, particularly when they're working across language barriers. But what I noticed from Paul, and I liked from what Paul talked about, particularly in terms of St. Benedict, was the fact that St. Benedict was focusing very much on integrating individual needs with his brotherhood, I think. But anyway, and I think that is a key aspect in my particular area, and I noticed it with both team leaders that I interviewed. Yeah.
Well, do you have how does your research work? Do you do interviews, or
was that a question for me?
Sorry.
What's your methodology?
Was that for me?
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
My methodology, well, I'm using semi-structured interviews, and I did explore the amount of structure that I used, on occasions making it slightly looser, and having come to the end of the process, looking back, it's interesting. I think probably I explored it with just three of my interviews were slightly looser, and actually they're a bit more difficult now to organize in terms of the analysis coming up, because they're not quite in such clear sections. But I have to say, looking back on it, perhaps there is a higher density of more interesting detail that's come out of those interviews, where I just allowed people a little bit more of space to talk, and things came up that I would never have thought about. So that's been an interesting perspective. But yes, just simply so far 21 semi-structured interviews. Right. Initially I had in mind to go back and do a Bristol online survey as well, but I think actually the number of interviews I was able to conduct has been very thorough. So I think I'm probably okay now actually with that data.
Yeah. Michelle has a question for Louisa. Louisa, thank you. How do you think the new tech we are now all using in communication will affect the way we integrate different languages? I think that's a really interesting question. I struggle sometimes with Zoom to coordinate the language, the mouth movement, and connect it to the sound that I'm hearing, because I think there's a very slight delay. So I can imagine it must be even more difficult in a different language. But Louisa, do you have an answer for Michelle's question?
Yes, that's a very, very good question, Michelle. But I mean, in business, particularly communicating across regions, across the world, they have been using this kind of technology for quite some time now. And in my interviews, I was using this technology as well, because I only managed a couple of face-to-face interviews. The rest were all via Skype. And so, yes, it is quite tough, and I do think that particularly when people are communicating in a foreign language, it's even tougher for them. And sometimes technology is not always very favorable to us. You sometimes get sort of interference, or you know, people are, I know it's across time zones as well, so there's that inconvenience too. But it's when technology is not always working well, and also for some of those virtual calls, I didn't actually have it in my interviews, but I know that some of those team members sometimes use simultaneous translation, and that doesn't always work as well as as is intended. Although technology is getting more and more advanced and it's working very well, I mean, for a lot of the time, you don't sometimes get those nuances across. And very often, sometimes there are even situations where people are, in terms of culture as well, can sometimes be a little neglectful to think of what they're saying. There was one example where one particular very nationalistic Irishman was talking about a project in China, when really he meant Japan, and the Japanese audience were listening to this throughout the conversation, and he kept on saying China, the project in China, when he meant Japan. And in the end, another member of the team said, look, it's not China, it's Japan. And he sort of apologized, but didn't quite. But you know, there are all sorts of things like that, and they happen, and particularly when we're doing it across through technology, I think that the pressure is even kind of, it's not the same as being in a room, you know, and I think that there is always that added extra hurdle that we have to get over, and I think that can be a problem.
You're on mute, Kim.
Thank you. It's because I was clicking, so thanks. Okay, thank you very much. If no one has any other questions, I'd really like to thank our panelists today, Paul Bryant and Louisa Weinzel, and thank you for two really interesting papers. And again, I think they spoke to each other very well. Just a reminder that next week we have the macro and the micro, the political economy of South America, and the first paper is from Dr. Chris Wilde, and the second is from Dr. Daliani Kirsch from Richmond University. So same time, same place, and I hope to see you all there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.